You may have heard that crowds in Havana and other Cuban cities have been protesting for freedom, resembling social justice protesters in the US last year, or maybe not resembling them. Discontent in California may be moving the state a little closer to regime change. Big labor, namely teachers' unions, is pressuring their members to teach the right thing on race, while Washington presses big tech to squelch misinformation. All these stories have something in common. We'll talk about what that is in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Welcome, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, and we aim to bring you something of an independent perspective on the events of the day. As always, I am joined by my two very able colleagues. First of all, David Theroux, founder and president of Independent Institute. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to see you.
So glad you're here. We haven't done this for a couple of weeks. Glad we can do it again. And Bill Evers, Williamson Evers, PhD, who is the head of Independent Institute's Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill.
Hello.
Great to see you again. Great to see the evidence of the erudition mounting behind you in your bookcases there. So we are wanting to talk a little bit, start off here about what's been happening in Cuba. According to the British Broadcasting System, BBC says that thousands of Cubans have been protesting or were protesting in the streets. They're protesting, according to the report on the BBC, economic collapse, food medicine shortages, rising prices, and interestingly, the way that the COVID pandemic has been handled by the Cuban government. According to one protester interviewed by the BBC, we're just asking for freedom. On the other hand, the current president, at least the titular president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, says that these are just mercenaries and counter-revolutionaries. Wow. So what do you think's really, I'll start with Bill Evers. What do you think is really going on here with these Cuban protests, Bill?
Well, I think it's very interesting that they were shouting freedom, freedom. So that's clearly a major thing for them. But I think it's fascinating that the New York Times emphasized the economic problems and the fact that the Cuban government says all the economic problems are due to the embargo of the United States government. So it's sort of a deja vu experience with this. It is clear, of course, they are having economic problems. And what should we expect we shouldn't expect anything otherwise.
I mean, the demand for liberty and the economic problems kind of go hand in hand. Lack of liberty means
hand in glove. That's right.
No freedom, no stuff.
So there are several interesting aspects to this. Of course, the secret police have rounded up people, but the interesting thing is how many Cubans said among themselves and to others that they had lost their fear. They had the regime had kept them in fear, and that they were so tired of it, so disgusted with it, that they had gone beyond that fear. So they were willing to have adverse consequences. And another thing is the role that social media played in this. So the protest had local origins. It had some origins in artists protesting. It had origins in the much vaunted among the American leftists health system in Cuba being a total failure. But it spread by social media. It spread by people showing video of the massive protests, and that helped liberate the Cuban populace from fear.
Amazing.
Also, I think it's worth mentioning that the scapegoat that's usually used of the embargo of the U.S., the embargo does exist, but the embargo is a pretty weak embargo. I think it's like 90% of trade is still going on between the U.S. and Cuba, and something like
people ship to Panama and then ship to Cuba.
Yes, and about 90 countries trade with Cuba, so it's not really anything to do with the issue.
According to our senior fellow Alvaro Vargas Llosa in his recent piece, which you can find on independent.org, by the way, he says that there's not the slightest sign of transition to liberal democracy in Cuba. What do you make of that, David?
Well, part of it is the hold that the Castro family has in the country through family, and obviously loyalists. And so there has been a certain amount of economic liberalization, but it's still pretty trivial. You can't really build a business over a certain size because the fear is that you would then have influence politically that could not be controlled. And of course, the neighborhoods are all still controlled by these communist committees that if anybody steps out of line, they're quickly dealt with.
But that was overwhelmed, and the committees for defense of the revolution were overwhelmed.
That's what I was going to say, is that even though they have these factors and the state police and the spying and so on, there is a certain the corruption is rampant, but I would say there's a certain age quality to the system, and the social media has been a big factor. And I think, just generally speaking, the young who know about the fact that things are better elsewhere don't buy the narrative anymore. And of course, the American left, which has largely been a great apologist for the Cuban system, not the least of which is Bernie Sanders, talking about the free health care and free education and so on. Continue it, but just how credible is this? And of course, over the years, when there were protests in the past, they would use that as a way to reduce the population by allowing them to escape, quote unquote. And in other words, you get rid of the bad eggs, so to speak, the troublemakers, and you reduce the number of people who are putting pressure on the health system. Now that may happen again, but again, the control of information is just too hard to maintain. And so I think that
it could be that either private philanthropists or maybe the U.S. government would put up balloons, kind of like weather balloons, that could take control of the internet away from the Castro government. That would be a kind of Radio Free Europe kind of thing. That would be a big help to the dissidents there. We haven't seen this yet, but the idea has certainly been raised.
Right. I mean, and if someone were to put up additional funding, they could actually position a satellite over Cuba that would handle the internet and communications.
Wow.
So you'd have piracy, which could not be blocked.
Right. Reminds us of the old 1960s pirate radio station.
Exactly. The offshore pirate radio station, for example, that existed.
Radio Luxembourg, radio this, radio
that.
Yeah.
Off London and so on,
Right.
Somebody mentioned that the power in Cuba is still much in the hands of the Castro family. Raul stepped
and the military, too.
And the military, which hand in glove there. But it seems that Miguel Diaz-Canel is something of a puppet of Raul Castro and the Castro family. But the deeper issue is not, does one family have too much sway? The real issue is, does that governmental party military complex have too much control over society as a whole? That's the bigger issue. It's not as if they'd be fine if the government had the same amount of power but was held by more people. It might be a little better, but the reality is that the reason they don't have enough,
or a different family. It is interesting how this, in many ways, partakes of a Iberian-American caudillo type of rule in certain ways, even though it's mediated through the Communist Party. One of the problems with the successors having the same kind of success that the Castros were able to have is they don't have that caudillo type of popularity and ability to sway crowds.
Yes. And I think the whole thing has been ossified.
Yes, ossified, exactly.
Right.
Good word.
Yeah.
No, I was kind of... Go ahead,
communism is basically an apologia for an oligarchy.
Right.
And they all operate that way. And the true believers who are sucked into the delusion are, the useful idiots. But I think that's wearing thin.
It is wearing thin. Unfortunately, the revolutionary ideology is always ready to justify pretty much anything. And since the revolutionary ideology is all about moving in ultimately to a new era of human history, eradicating the bourgeois mentality, there's really no governmental exercise of power which cannot be justified by the revolutionary ideology. So the ideology is something of kind of a covering or window dressing, but boy, it sure can be used for anything that anybody wants to do. That's the trouble with world transformative ideologies as the basis of power.
Right.
Now, speaking of turnovers in government, possible turnovers, we here in California have a potential peaceable turnover of government. So our governor is now subject to recall.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing. I think probably unfairly referred to that as potential regime change in California. That was tongue in cheek, to be fair. But politically,
it is regime. You're right. It is regime change.
It's kind of a regime change, but regardless, I mean, it's getting pretty serious. At first, a lot of people thought, oh well, they just happened when a lot of Californians were in a moment of pique over the French Laundry, that they happened to get just enough signatures to make this recall happen. But now, actually, while Governor Newsom's position seemed to be strengthening, it now seems to be weakening. Either of you seen recent poll results?
Yes, we have.
What do you see?
So there's two polls out there. One, University of California at Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies, and one, Emerson College, and they both show very close between recall Newsom and not recall Newsom. So they're not tied, but they're very, very close to within the margin of error. So it's kind of a tie, is how I would put it. And then the other interesting thing is among the Republican challengers, who's doing well.
Right. And I think the first point about the within the margin of error poll numbers, that has changed significantly from the time Larry Elder announced his candidacy.
That's right.
At last, there's somebody who has some charisma, who has some sort of celebrity status, who knows the ideas, who can cut through the demographic appeal.
Right.
And I think that...
and cut through the demagogic appeal, too.
Absolutely, right. And I think that people are looking for someone who they can trust. And I think that, that was part of the real reason why Newsom started losing credibility was the French Laundry. The most recent thing is that there are photos found of his son at a camp not wearing a mask after Newsom, his father, had mandated them for all summer camps. So Newsom and his wife took their son and daughter out of the camps. That's another
I feel sorry for the
hypocrisy,
kid.
Right? But I also think part of the credibility is...
Speaking of his kid, Newsom told an interviewer that his kid was learning at home when the child was in a private school and going to in-person instruction.
That's right.
So
and then,
there's a lot of elitist deception going on here.
Right. And another part of the deception, this goes back a little bit, was that Newsom had mandated that all the wineries be shut except for his, Plum Jack.
Amazing.
Right. So it's pretty stark. And part of it is because this arrogance that a lot of these progressives have. And of course, Newsom is part of the broader Pelosi regime and machine, so to speak. But I think that the credibility of Newsom continues to decline, and people want a reason to vote that they can believe in. And they didn't have that with any of the candidates that were being offered. But I do think whether it's true or not, but I think that's the perception. And I think that Larry Elder is a legitimate alternative to people, and the more they hear from him, the harder they find that appealing.
So I think David is right about the effect of Elder, that he kind of broke the logjam on this. He has a nationally syndicated radio show with 1.5 million listeners, so that means hundreds of thousands in California.
Well, he's especially popular in Los Angeles County when he was with KABC.
Right, where he began many years ago.
Yeah.
And he's written half a dozen books. which are quite accessible, but nonetheless, you can see that research went into them. He's on Fox News fairly often. He, he has a lot going for him. I do want to mention, because politics is up and down and volatile and amazing things can happen. So two other strong contenders are Caitlyn Jenner, the athlete, who has been pretty deft at handling some tricky questions. She was on a television talk show, The View, and pronouns were mangled, and she said, well, the pronouns are not as important as all the problems in California. That's a pretty good answer.
That was a good answer.
And so the issue of transgender athletes, boys competing in girls' sports, biological boys.
She's against it, right?
And she said she's against that. She doesn't think it's fair. That was, again, a deft answer.
Yeah, but so Jenner changed and equivocated on that afterward.
Yeah, I heard that too.
I mean, nobody's perfect in these things. I'm just trying to alert our viewers that there's some other people. Another, I think, potentially strong candidate is Kevin Faulconer. He ran one of the biggest cities in the state, San Diego. He has a pretty strong track record of accomplishing things, which is not easy to do in politics in California. And, he might be a bit liberal to go through a regular Republican primary, but let's say it's a Democrat trying to choose which of the alternative candidates he might support. Mm-hmm. The fact that Faulconer is a bit of a moderate might be helpful to him. Yeah. So we have to see how this all spins out. He certainly, it's a typical thing. The ideal candidate should have the name recognition of Jenner, the political beliefs of Larry Elder, and the governing experience of Kevin Faulconer. We have the perfect person.
There you go. Just to be clear on the procedure, as I understand it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned statistical, margin of error. With that, I think you're talking about the yes/no on recall or not recall.
So of the Republican candidates, there's no prominent Democrats running right now.
Right. Yes.
And if Newsom loses on the yes/no on recall, then Newsom can't run in the alternative slate. So it will be probably one of these Republicans.
Which means that one of them would become governor regardless
and all
of...
they need is a plurality.
Exactly,
they can have a very small percentage of the vote. It doesn't matter because there are 40 plus candidates in the running.
So from a point of view of sort of pure democratic theory, that might seem problematic. You could get a governor elected who only got maybe 18% of the vote or something like that.
It's the system.
But it's constitutionally valid. And sometimes these constitutional mechanisms are deliberately designed so that it won't always be majority whim. Sometimes the majority sets up processes which can solve problems by allowing for an unusual outcome like this.
There's another factor which I think goes to Elder's advantage, is that, like in other races around the country, there is a particular appeal for candidates who are successful, who are articulate, who bring a vision, but are not part of the establishment.
Right,
and he meets all those. Yes.
He meets all those, right? And I think he's. I understand that he's going to be. We're talking about Elder again. I think he's already indicated that he's going to be speaking very actively with Black and Hispanic communities and so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be a significant factor. Mm-hmm. Now, if it turns out that Elder or any of the Republicans win, that's going to affect the 2022 election significantly. And
really
so the key is...
Bear in mind that the Democrats have supermajorities in the legislature.
So a Governor Elder will be able to do very little, but he can talk.
It depends.
Yes, it depends.
First of all, I mean, we've had Republican governors in California with Democratic legislatures who have done well. And, it depends on if you can peel off some of the Democratic legislators, if you can find common ground, as they say in politics. So, but I agree with you, Graham, that at first glance, it seems like he'd have a pretty tough time.
But I think also in California, there's certain unusual factors as far as executive orders and all sorts of other things that the governor can do.
Yes, that's true.
And there's also the initiative process for that matter. So I mean,
Right.
I think
and the Democrats may present a very unified facade, but underneath there's
they're fractured.
serious disagreements
Yes.
between the
Yeah.
moderate Democrats and the progressive Democrats.
and also they're affected by these same issues. So I think,
Right.
Yeah.
like across the country, there are many things in play, and I think Elder, if he is the person, is smart enough. He's an attorney, he's a best-selling author, talk show host, very successful. We've had him speak here on one of his books. It was very popular.
And he does not come from a privileged background. He
No,
is a
he does
self-made
not.
man.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's for
Exactly.
sure. The California executives do have considerable executive powers. That's true. I'm just wondering. This is kind of an aside, and I don't want to.
Not quite as much as Newsom says they have, though.
Well, I know, but that's where I'm going. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do wonder if the yes to the Newsom recall numbers may be edging up partly in response to recent exercises of Governor Newsom's executive order power, like he's now imposing new vaccine mandates.
Right. So
Right.
that was the thing that triggered people originally, and then you had the French Laundry issue and so on. But it's astounding that he's claiming we'll be the first state in the country to impose universal masking of children and all this other stuff. And I think people have gotten to the point where they just, it's just not credible.
Masking of children is worthless.
Oh, man.
It's actually
it's
it's actually
damaging.
harmful.
The only reason for masks is if you are infectious, that you have the COVID-19 and you're spitting, sneezing, coughing, and droplets are coming out. The aerosolized breathing of such a person goes right through the mask and right around the edges of the mask.
Yep.
And so also wearing the mask does not protect you from the aerosolized particles. They are tiny and they go right through the holes in all masks, inclingN95.
But as you said, if you're coughing, and sputtering,
Yeah.
spittle.
That's why doctors, when
Right.
they have a surgical operation underneath them and they don't want to be infecting a sterile operating environment, they put a mask on. It's to stop the droplets. It's not to stop
the
them
aero-
breathing, because if they
Right.
stop breathing, then they're finished.
Well, and in addition, I mean, we can go off on all sorts of tangents on it, but one thing I should mention is that most people wearing masks, cloth masks have become the most popular, but most people don't discard the cloth mask after they use it. They keep it, and you have all sorts of things growing in the mask.
Yeah, the
and
simplest
you're
thing is
breathing-
they're worthless.
Right. And so I think, I mean, for example, Rand Paul has a bill he's proposed to rescind the mandate that people have to wear a mask in any sort of public transportation systems, train stations, airports, airlines, and so on. Now, the particular rule that exists on that was extended, I think, about a month ago through mid-September. So he's trying to stop that in part because of the summer season. But he's right. It is not based on the science, and it actually can be counterproductive for people.
So I was just reading a book called Superstition, a very short introduction, which is a 1990 publication of Oxford University Press. And it's about all sorts of things, the number 13, walking under ladders, black cats, all sorts of things. But one of the things that it talks about is the illusion of control. So when people are filled with anxiety and worry, they grasp at straws to try to reassure themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And wearing a favorite piece of jewelry, or putting, a baseball player eating a certain meal before going into a game, all that sort of stuff doesn't really give you any control, but it gives you the illusion of control. And I think that largely the mask wearing is doing that for people. So it's not the science, as David points out, it's this superstition.
And also, I think there's a certain psychology to people who wear masks and insist that others wear masks. They're people who are
a badge of control and being controlled.
yeah, but it's from a high risk averse, phobic view of the world, and it manifests in other things that they do in their life as far as foods and whatever. It's the fallacy that you're going to take some precaution even though the probability of you being injured is less than being struck by lightning. But people don't understand that, and so they will over control.
So since we're talking about this disputed thing about masks, it reminds me that Senator Amy Klobuchar has decided that Big Brother knows best when it comes to social media. So she wants to get rid of Section 230 that protects social media platforms and have the government establish what is valid health information and have the companies sued if they allow any misinformation, as deemed by the government, to go on their platforms. This is very frightening.
Wow.
Science can only proceed through debate. And if we have both little public debate on policy and little scientific debate and media platforms, it is much worse for our country and for our society and our freedoms going forward.
Right.
This is a very, very dangerous thing.
Well, stepping into that subject maybe a little bit more deeply then, if we're going to turn there now maybe, it is quite striking that while Amy Klobuchar's proposal may be more extreme than some things we've seen, already it's been clear that the Biden administration has been cueing Facebook and urging them to flag things. And Jen Psaki herself, President Biden's press secretary, has made it clear there's been communication with big tech so as to squelch what they consider misinformation. And of course,
and making them proxies of the government.
That's right.
In effect, yeah. I mean,
yes, that's right.
To be fair, some of the people involved, they're just thinking narrowly about health information. And we want to make sure that people don't get the wrong ideas because somebody might get sick and then somebody might die at some point. That may be the motivation, but you think about it. If in fact government officials are supposedly appropriately leaning on Facebook and others to control what is and what isn't available on health information, where does that stop? If that's appropriate, a friend of mine said to me earlier today, one of my colleagues, that it starts with suppressing so-called misinformation about COVID, and then the next thing you know, government's going to be asking Facebook to suppress misinformation about critical race theory or misinformation about gender. Once you establish that it's okay for government to lean on these private companies to control, to direct them to use and not use their power to squelch information, that's pretty scary. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, imagine, this is just imaginary. Imagine Donald Trump runs again for the presidency. Imagine he wins. And imagine that we've now all gotten comfortable with this idea that the White House can lean on Facebook to decide what should and shouldn't be on Facebook. Then are we going to have, Donald Trump telling Facebook, you got to take out stuff that's misinformation about Donald Trump? I mean, where would this end?
That's right.
I'm concerned about health misinformation. There's a lot of false stuff out on the internet, but I'm even more concerned about the growth of this power to direct social media information.
Right. And I think part of this, Trump has this lawsuit against a number of big tech companies based on this view that they are acting as agents. And they're
That's
not
part of it, yeah.
Right. They're not.
And they've handed him a sword.
They've handed him a sword.
The
That's
Biden
right.
administration has handed Trump a sword.
That's right. Exactly. And so I think there is a legitimate case. I'm not sure that Trump's case is that. It may be, and they can revise it before it's actually finally submitted. But in any event, I do think there is something to this. And this whole problem of collusion we've talked about in past episodes of Independent Outlook about collusion between government and private actors, in which either they're threatened, or in other words, either they comply or they're going to be subject to some special taxes or regulation, whatever it might be.
And of course, in this case,
a carrot,
threat of
right? So
antitrust
we'll give you
Wall Street.
will give you special contracts and access if you comply. And usually these go together. So
carrot and stick.
Right, carrot and stick. And so all the major social media giants, there's evidence that have been involved in this significantly. And they all have large contracts with different government agencies. So if you look at it from sort of the perspective of the deep state, and you want to basically control information in society, this is sort of a logical way to do it. You essentially subcontract it to private entities, which allegedly are exempt from the First Amendment. They do your bidding, you get the same thing accomplished, and then there are plenty of people who will then come to the defense of these private entities on First Amendment grounds. And so you get your cake and eat it too. You have even the people who you're critiquing and silencing defending the practice. So it's there's nothing new. You know, it goes back to the ancient world and through the Middle Ages and so forth of monarchs pushing these kinds of deals. And of course, in the United States, the corruption of Tammany Hall and many other instances where information is controlled, and during wars in American history, World War I and so on, and up to the present. So I think that this is also an argument against allowing government entities to be exempt from the rule of law. The Patriot Act is one egregious example of this, but there are others. And I think it's important that we insist on the integrity of a free market where all the actors are subject to the rule of law and not giving protection to some over others to do the bidding of political interest, basically.
To do the bidding, that's the key thing. I mean, let me just take half a step back. I can imagine there might be somebody who's with us today who may have been distracted for a minute and then hears us talking a bit about the social media censorship. You can imagine such a person might say, wait a minute, I thought you guys were all in favor of private property and you wanted private companies to be able to do it. But we are. The whole point here is, of course,
the point. The
private companies have begun forfeiting their privateness as the state has begun controlling it.
The key thing is to stop the state from pressuring people. So the big thing, as the Wall Street Journal has pointed out, is they have the club of antitrust, which is getting bipartisan support these days. And they're using that club, which is, behind their back but sticking over their shoulders, so to speak, to corral these social media platforms into following the regime's counsel, advice, and message. So it's not a good situation.
Here's an analogy to maybe really kind of put it in extreme terms, but look back just to the 20th century. Lenin and Stalin, the way they dealt with private economic power was they nationalized and took over the companies.
Right.
The way that Hitler dealt with it is he let them remain in private hands but made them do what he wanted.
That's right.
And so either way, the state power is controlling what happens, either directly or indirectly. And if either way, it falls afoul of the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the speech or of the press. And that means, of course, not only Congress, but also all government power in the U.S. via the 14th Amendment cannot be abridged by state actors. And when these private companies basically give themselves over to
they're either commandeered or act in the place of the state at the state's encouragement. The courts have said they can't really do that and invade the rights of the Bill of Rights.
Right. But the crucial thing, though, to me is that, and maybe we in particular here at Independent Institute can help shed light on where the lines of demarcation fall. But it strikes me that
it's not always completely easy.
No, it's not easy. So for example, I'm thinking we want to make it clear that we're not complaining about government leaders or politicians advocating ideas or policies. Sometimes that's their job, right?
Right.
What we're complaining about is deploying their power and state influence to control the outcome through that indirect process. We're not against persuasion. We're against coercion.
Right.
Right.
And what's going on here is a form of indirect coercion. As I say, some of it well-intended. Many of the participants scarcely
Some of
aware.
it not well intended. Let's be honest.
Oh, okay, you're probably right. But some people.
But some of it is well intended.
Yeah,
but,
and some people scarcely.
don't be too generous.
Yeah,
But a lot of people scarcely realize what's going on because it's a climate of opinion and it's being fostered by state act, and people are sort of adapting themselves. They don't quite know that it's part of a larger pattern.
And that's one of the reasons why the COVID crisis is useful, because it gives this fear-mongering and uncertainty about the future. Right.
It's interesting, though. There's all this pushback. So today's New York Times is full of stories. So it looks like the federal government is going to, and the state government in California are going to require public workers to take, or at least a large number of public workers, particularly healthcare workers, to take the vaccine, whether they don't.
Now, is that wrong?
Well, let's put it this way. There's about a third of healthcare workers who have not been vaccinated. The thing is, the elderly, the ones who are really in danger from this, have been vaccinated. And so, in a sense, the people who haven't been vaccinated have assumed the risk of that. And so, I mean, I can't rework my own life about their choice. And, I don't want to unduly burden them, but I don't really want to go around wearing a mask just because they decided not to get vaccinated. And so I think the protests of all this imposition and mandatory stuff is often quite reasonable. Interestingly enough, in America, the unions are among the people pushing back hardest. So we have healthcare workers unions, service employee international union.
You mean they're against
police benevolent associations?
They're against mask mandates for their members.
They're against vaccine mandates.
Vaccine mandates. Yeah,
that's a lot of what's going on.
That's fascinating.
The thing that the CDC has changed, and will probably change by the next time. If you're not watching this live, and it may have changed already by the time you watch it.
Yes.
But they're saying that in areas with leaping caseloads, now remember, a lot of these caseloads are very minor or the product of false positive testing. But anyway, in cases where the caseload of COVID is rising, then you have to be wearing a mask, even if you're vaccinated, which is, of course, ridiculous since these masks are largely ineffective unless you're an infected person spitting. Now, so this is what's going on, and the federal government and the state government of California are pushing their employees sort of sector by sector into having mandatory vaccines, and the unions are pushing back. And the unions are pretty strong, so we'll see what happens. But it's a fascinating thing to sort of have Biden versus the unions.
Well, I think it'll also affect
and Newsom versus the unions.
It's going to affect the election, I predict, in California.
It will make them a lot less enthusiastic for Newsom.
That's
and
right.
He needs them as the shock troops, the people that are willing to go door to door.
And just as a perspective on the whole COVID situation, when Biden took office, there was a total of 3,056 people dying that week on a 7-day average. And since that time, for example, on February 20th, that number had gone down to 1,904. In March, it was 1,083. It is now 595. So the trajectory of deaths continues to drop significantly.
So this is the bell-shaped curve is going down.
Yep.
A certain amount of this is the vaccine. A certain amount of this is not enough hosts for the, both people who've gotten it and now have natural immunity.
Yes.
Some people, the children who have colds and other coronaviruses or don't have the receptors that adults do. All these different factors are making it tough for virulent dangerous kinds of COVID cases happening. So hospitalizations and deaths are definitely going down, as David's pointing out, but hysteria is still having its leaps and bounds over caseloads.
Well, the scaremongering is useful, and there's also a huge amount of misinformation and fear-mongering. But anyway, the point here is also that the risk of dying from the variant is tiny.
Very small, very small.
And
Exactly right.
It's especially true, and has been. It's even more true now for children. And this whole push by Fauci and others that all children have to be vaccinated is a disgrace.
Yeah, I heard a comment from a dear friend of mine recently, father of small children, who is really alarmed at the psychological and social damage to his children of everyone cowering under masks and little children trying to understand why they have to this thing over their face. He's concerned about people getting sick from COVID, but he's equally concerned about the damage to his children psychologically from this masking obsession.
There are 2 lawsuits in California against Newsom, and officials in the state health departments. I think one group is called Let Children Breathe, and there's another one, I forget the other. And these are basically based on the science and pointing out that this is really a threat to the well-being of children.
Right.
How
so
about...
it is interesting, though, that and I was talking to Scott Atlas, who was President Trump's advisor, part of the advisory team during the Trump administration on COVID, and he did think that it was interesting that in Germany and especially France, there has been public demonstrations of thousands of people.
Yes.
So we do have, as I mentioned, these unions and other people, conservative politicians, resisting some of these mandatory moves by the government, but it's a public demonstration. And so Macron, the president of France, has said he's going to fire health workers that don't get vaccinated and things like this. And this is in the face of a country that has insane labor protection laws. I mean, you can't, you know.
France is the apogee of the Western world on that.
It's just, we would be astounded at how permanent a job is in France. And the 2 extremes, so Macron holds himself out to be a centrist. That I will call him a centralizing centrist. But anyway, he's formerly in the Socialist Party, but in the supposedly more right wing of it. But the 2 most extreme parties in France, so there's a sort of a super communist party and there's a ultra-nationalist party that historically has had some fascist tendencies, and they are defending freedom. They're saying, look, what is it? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. We're getting rid of the liberté. And, this is just not going to stand. And obviously, thousands of protesters are in the streets in France.
Right, and it's also tapped into the Yellow Vest movement.
Yes, which also had a strong Liberté component. It was an anti-tax movement.
Right. So they're fighting against the gasoline taxes and so on.
Right.
So and this is a grassroots middle class movement.
Right. Because Macron is a super establishment figure.
Yes.
He really is.
And Italy has a similar situation.
Yes, I agree.
You know,
if we can speak of Italy as having a government.
Right. I mentioned earlier that the BBC was quoting protesters in Cuba as saying, we're just asking for freedom. I'm hearing echoes here all the way along in our conversation that people in different ways they're chafing at restrictionism and centralizing power. And it's a significant public pushback against centralizing power.
It's interesting how poorly centralization works. You know, one of the big fears that people have about China is that their foreign new Silk Road plan is going to take over the world, and that China is going to be super successful in pushing Chinese companies all over the world, and the power is going to follow this. But the fascinating thing is that since we had our last program, China's chip manufacturing giant, that it was going to be its equivalent of Intel, has failed. It's going down the toilet. And so all these centralization moves are subject to all the things that Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek and all the other serious critics of socialism say, that you can't really price things effectively. You can't really maneuver information, take account of new information if everybody at the center is deciding things. So, we're lucky that the Chinese are so dumb as to preserve these centralizing socialistic elements.
Because it ossifies.
Otherwise, there would be more. That's right. It ossifies, to use that word again.
We did a book called China's Great Migration,
Right.
about the rise of markets and sort of indigenous enterprise when the restrictions were relaxed on people being able to move. This is like 20, 25 years ago. And within a very short time, 260 million people got up and just started moving. And they were desperate because they were starving, essentially, in the rural areas. And as they were going along, they were creating businesses and they were cooperating. and towns were created and they turned into huge cities. And the government couldn't stop it, but they were there. And this created an immense amount of wealth. It brought 1 billion people out of poverty, the greatest anti-poverty program in the history of mankind.
Right.
But the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, was still there, and
Right.
they're trying now to direct it in ways to advance their agenda. And the more they tried to do that, as Bill's saying, the harder it is, because central planning doesn't work. It's an enormously complex problem. Milton Friedman had believed that if you have a system in which you don't have political freedom and economic freedom develops, that can result in political freedom. I'm not completely convinced that's true, but I do think that there are elements that put pressure on it, and it's
a funny joke.
It's a
Friedman
cultural factor that rules.
Mm-hmm.
Friedman had a funny joke, is that under socialism, the Sahara Desert would run out of sand.
That's right, exactly.
pretty good one.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, in my own field of education, the Chinese government has just made a big surprise move. So there are lots of private tutoring companies and private schools to help train aspiring, striving families, children in China. There's a big for-profit education sector. I mean, billions and billions of dollars, lots of foreign investment. The Chinese government just last weekend cracked down on this. No more for-profit education in China.
Yeah.
So for a while, of course, they've been cracking down on curriculum, saying you can't have anti-communist, they broadly construe anti-communist as anything favoring free speech, checks and balances, Western values, et cetera, but you can't have any of that. And essentially, they're cracking down on private curriculum construction, all sorts of things that the private sector had moved into the rather shoddy public education system in China, even though it's high performing in some other ways like math, but certainly in humanities and social sciences, there's plenty of room for improvement. And now they're driving the private sector out, and with immense loss of wealth, not to speak of the terrible, terrible loss of freedom and of learning.
And that issue before the crackdown is discussed in our book, Really Good Schools by James Tooley, in which
highly recommended book.
He discusses the existence of these indigenous private schools, high quality, low cost schools.
Yeah.
And of course,
they now are a big threat to the state, though.
A big threat to the state. And so because they're so effective.
I think somebody in the Chinese government read this book, David. That's
Maybe.
what I'm thinking.
They realized it was a threat.
But it's also the crackdown on other cultural institutions, churches and right. so forth, the family itself. And
family, especially in the Muslim areas.
right, but it's a fallacy. It's a fundamental fallacy. It goes against the natural law reality of people and institutions that support people and values and harmony and prosperity. But pride is a powerful thing, and people get seduced into it.
We can have harmony under heaven through free enterprise and freedom.
Yeah.
Exactly. You were mentioning a little bit ago about the curricular and other mandates in China. Speaking of that and the centralizing tendencies we've been worrying about here, I am thinking back in your area again, Bill, of the fact that about 3 weeks ago, the largest teachers union in the country, National Education Association, had some kind of a major conference and adopted a bunch of policy, including
their annual national conference.
That's what it was, yeah. And they adopted a measure saying that they want to increase implementation of critical race theory.
Right.
They want the teachers who are their members and those who aren't too, but I guess they all have to be members to have their job. So they want all their members to be getting professional development and implicit bias.
Right.
They're
going to provide union support if there's any pushback from the state legislature against doing this.
And here's this thing. There was a delegate-approved measure. I'm reading from the Wall Street Journal. Sure. Delegate-approved measure calls on the union to create a study criticizing white supremacy, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, racism, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and other forms of power and oppression at the intersection of our
Great pronunciation. Terrific pronunciation.
But this sounds like the Central Ministry of Education propaganda of the Communist Party in Beijing.
Yeah. Sounds like the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's 1984.
Yeah.
This is all going on. It's funny because in the other union, the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, the president, said, there's no critical race theory being taught. Mm-hmm. And then she proceeds to have Mr. Kendi, one of the leading spokespeople in the United States for critical race theory, address her convention. So there's all kinds of hypocrisy and lies, as well as pushing of this ideological and untruthful account of America.
And on CNN, he then declared that he was not a supporter of critical race theory.
Well,
it's kind of
stunning. It's just amazing. Yeah. It's amazing.
One thing I might throw out also is there have been riots and a lot of bedlam, whatever you want to call it, in South Africa.
Right.
And South Africa is sort of the poster child for critical race theory. The African National Congress was and still is major proponents, and they're actually the moderate group, the party.
Right.
That's
South
right.
Africa.
There's a freedom fighters group that's super duper communist instead of just so the African National Congress, the anti-apartheid umbrella group, is in collaboration with the South African Communist Party, runs the government.
Right. So the more radical group is called the Broad-Based Black Economic Employment. I'm sorry. That's their policy. Right. That's their measure. That's right.
And that creates crony capitalism out the wazoo.
Right. So the group that pushes it is called the Economic Freedom Fighters, and so this is to judge people based on race and
Actually,
to allocate.
I'm going to slightly disagree with you. The African National Congress pushes this black empowerment capitalism.
Yes.
Not the freedom fighters. The freedom fighters just want to take away everything.
That's what I'm saying.
They're expropriators and total communists. The African National Congress and the Communist Party instead empower pet companies. The pet individuals have to be hired that have some connection to the party, have to be given equity in companies and developments. And so it's the most extreme kind of unproductive cronyism.
Right.
And that's partly why this rioting is going on, because they see certain pet blacks getting fabulous success, fabulous wealth, while there's a very, very large unemployment and very poor implementation of vaccines. I mean, I could go on and on there.
Right.
Public utilities are a mess. Everything is a mess in the country. But the trade unions for education are another catastrophe. The schools are not improving. The teachers' unions in South Africa are, again, corrupt and ineffectual and won't allow any improvements that could actually bring future prospects of success to the
And that's sounding familiar to the U.S.
It's even more, I have to say it's even more extreme in South Africa, but it's certainly, these stories from China and from South Africa give us plenty to worry about in the direction our country's going.
That's right.
Centralized power it's neither morally justifiable nor justifiable on its results.
Right.
Right. So the point here is they embraced and really take critical race theory to its logical conclusion.
Right.
And the people who benefit are a tiny group, maybe the Gupta family, for example, and others. But it's a side commentary, and it's quite different, incidentally, from what Mandela was proposing.
You know, one of the fun things about these conversations we have on Independent Outlook is that we are joined by hundreds of people every time we do this, many hundreds, and through our friends at thinkspot.com, we have participants who are tossing us questions. Sometimes also we have people joining us through Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. So sometimes there's a little bit of a lag as our friends are joining with us in the conversation. They're thinking about questions, which now I'm getting. Okay, so we're going to backtrack just to honor our friends who are with us, backtrack to a couple earlier subjects before we close the time today. So here's one from one of our participants via YouTube, recently submitted a couple minutes ago. Should we lift Cuba sanctions since they hurt the poor most? Okay, I'm sure both of you have an opinion about that.
I don't know if we have the same opinion. My opinion is yes.
Yeah, my opinion is yes, too.
Wow, okay. But my thought is that, I mean, people say it's a blockade, but it isn't a blockade because...
Right. We kind of went into that in our discussion, that there are workarounds.
Okay, so
and it means that a lot of the luxury goods end up either going to the ruling elite in Cuba or they benefit the military in various ways. The whole thing is not... Anyway, without going into it further, it would be better to get rid of the blockade. It also removes an excuse for the government.
Yeah,
really
that's one of the
non-performance.
I just mentioned that's one of the key things is that the Castro family has used the blockade as an excuse to justify its own power, that you have to stay in contact and support us, otherwise the U.S. is going to take you over. And who knows what's going to happen? You'll be oppressed by the American Yankee imperialists, etc. And so that's been used by rulers through the ages as a justification for oligarchic power.
Another question, going a little back also, we were talking about COVID and the Delta variant and so forth. So this is a question coming from one of our friends via ThinkSpot, who asks, who is right? Scott, we may not know, but anyway, here's the question. Who is right? Scott Gottlieb, who argues that the Delta variant will peak in 3 or 4 weeks and then begin to diminish, or Fauci and Walensky, who have no idea about the length and strength of the Delta variant? Well, do either of you know the answer to that question? I
don't think Scott Gottlieb has a clue.
But I don't think we have been surprised by the ups and downs of these variants. It is a seasonal thing. And so just because of summer, we may see a decline, but that doesn't mean that the different variants of COVID are gone. I think like flu and other things, it's going to be around. The important thing to realize is that all viruses diminish in their virulence. In other words, they want to keep the host alive so that they can stay alive.
Yes.
So the natural tendency of Darwinian evolution in these viruses is they'd like to be able to spread faster and better. So that's becoming, we're seeing this in the Delta thing. Exactly. So it's more contagious, but it's much less deadly.
Right.
And so we can expect that future things are also contagious, but less deadly as time goes on.
That's right. And the Nobel Prize virologist, the French scientist Luc Montagnier, has said that this push to have universal vaccinations because of this variant is a total mistake.
Yeah.
And in fact, he goes so far to say that the vaccines are actually essentially inducing variant forms to be created. Now they're weaker, but
That's fascinating.
They're trying to survive.
Well, it's just that's right. The virus is trying to survive whatever changes in its environment.
Exactly.
I want to actually go back to another thing though, and that is, in China we're seeing all this repression. We just had a protester who was carrying a banner around on his motor scooter, imprisoned now for terrorism. And that's secret police in China. And I'm concerned as I see things, people trying to pour money into the IRS, the FBI investigating a long-time, very respectable conservative women's group, Concerned Women of America, the whole history of the IRS during the Tea Party era. I think we should be very cautious in handing over power, unchecked power, to either the taxing authorities or the federal government's police force.
That's right, and the intelligence agencies, which have no accountability.
Yeah, very good point.
And haven't been too savvy either lately.
Right, but and as this relates to what we said before about the failure of socialism. Central planning and bureaucracy has internal errors, internal contradictions that they can't work out. And so they're going to make mistakes, and there are interest groups that capture them, and they'll be used for political and other purposes. So it goes back to the wisdom of the founders to radically constrain the power of the government and to disperse powers. And so all of this gets back to the central value of liberty and the rule of law.
So one of the things that the IRS was flagging to discover whether there's some kind of terrible thing that needed to be investigated by tax authorities and that maybe it wasn't a genuine thing, or any group that's promoting the Bible, religious faith.
Yep.
These are, because statistically speaking, Republicans are somewhat more religious than Democrats, therefore any group involved in Bible study must be a front for the Republican Party.
And therefore not deserving of tax exemption.
Yeah, right, exactly. So exactly right, Graham. This is a very totalitarian view of, suppressing religion and bringing everything within the state.
I was glad to see there was one organization called Christians Engaged, which had been denied on this exact basis. So they appealed and it was reversed.
Right.
But why should they even have to appeal?
Right.
Of course, it costs a lot of money to appeal these things.
It takes a lot of money,
Yeah.
So
and you can't do anything. Well, it just consumes you to have to go back for years of paperwork and prove that this and such meeting was actually about Bible study and not
about
Trump
politics,
campaign rally or something like that.
Well, a lot of it comes down to the fear that many government elites have. They don't want a competing standard that people will turn to that would question what they're doing or what they want to do, and that's certainly in China is a great
Falun
example.
Gong,
but it's why
Christian
we
churches
have
in
the
China.
First Amendment, and why a lot of people hundreds of years ago came to this continent for religious liberty reasons.
Right, that's right.
And so, but I do think the attempt to cancel and to marginalize religious groups, especially those that are related to the Decalogue tradition of the Ten Commandments and so forth, is a tell of what their fear is, which is a fear that people have an allegiance to objective morality and not to them.
Right.
Right.
Well, I
Exactly
think
so, David.
we are kind of coming in for a landing here. My parting shot would be "Viva la Cuba libre." And
I'm hoping that's a drink.
May it become very popular.
Maybe.
Thank you, Williamson Evers, for being part of this conversation. David Theroux,
thank you for hosting.
Thank you all
for hosting.
Right.
Great conversation. Thank you to our friends at ThinkSpot and all those from around the country, maybe around the world, who joined us for the conversation today. Remember, you can join us again on future episodes of Independent Outlook. We're taking a little bit of a lighter schedule during the summer. Our next scheduled Independent Outlook conversation will be, I believe, on August 25th, which is a Wednesday, as usual. So a few weeks from now. And then we'll pick up steam again and going into the fall and keep you fully abreast and giving you thorough interpretations of of public events so you can stay on top of it. And you can always go to independent.org for resources and the latest of our publications. With that said, thanks everybody. Thanks David. Thanks Bill. See you next time. Bye-bye.